So we've been in a series on 1 Corinthians. Good to have some new faces here. And this morning we've reached 1 Corinthians 14. And Paul's continuing his discussion of spiritual gifts, which he started in chapter 12. But now specifically he's going to talk about the context of the Christian assembly. And so this morning we want to talk about the topic of worship. But more specifically, the worship service, since worship actually happens in a lot of different contexts, and I'm not talking about those kinds of worship, I'm talking about the worship assembly. And when I was a kid, of course, we always associated worship with the church service. Sundays were all about going to church, and it was all about having the church service. And that language is really interesting if you think about it. Why is it that we call it a service? Well, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Of course, as a kid, there was really nothing particularly exciting about going to church. After all, you had to get up early, just like on a school day, and that wasn't real great. And then we had to drive, at least where I went to church, we had to drive 30 minutes in the car each way. And as a kid, that seemed like an eternity. That was just like forever. And then you sat on these like hard pews, and we sang these really old songs with strange words, some of them I didn't even understand, at a pace slower than death. That was great. And then people would get up and they would recite these prayers, and they sounded an awful lot like the prayers that we'd said the week before. And then, of course, there was communion, where they would serve you a very small portion, as we did this morning, of cracker and juice, which wasn't really a worthwhile snack anyway. And then they passed the plate and asked you to contribute money, which seemed a bit demanding to me because, after all, for the amount of cracker and juice you got, it should have been free, right? I mean, I was like, why were you paying for that? That just didn't seem right. And then, of course, there was the sermon. You had to sit through the sermon, and that was, as a child, man, that was rough. So the guy would get up and he would drone on and on and on, perhaps like I do sometimes. And of course, he talked about things I usually had no interest in, so I tried to occupy my mind with all kinds of other things just to get through it. But the real horror of all of this, and you have to really understand this, is that we would come back Sunday night and do it all over again. We went to church service twice on Sunday, and I thought, really, that's just a little bit of overkill to me. But if you'd asked me back then why all this was necessary, the only answer I could have given to you was, well, because God required it. God told us to do these things, and it was either do them or go to hell, and that just didn't seem like a good option, so we're going to do it anyway. Now, of course, that's not the best theology, but what would you expect from a kid? But I would hazard a guess, I would suspect that there are a lot of adults who don't have a much deeper view of worship than that church is something we do because we're simply being obedient to God, and that's what we have to do. Yet in the text before us this morning, we have some significant clues about early Christian worship, what it was and what they did and what it was for. And this is really interesting. And this is an important text because there's not a whole lot of passages in the New Testament that tell us a lot about early Christian worship. So let's get a little bit of the text in front of us. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 14, beginning in verse 1. If I can read it with my dim eyes, and I'll try. Pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. For the one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. On the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. The one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. Now, I want you all to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be built up. Now, brothers, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you, unless I bring you some revelation, or knowledge, or prophecy, or teaching? Now, it's in this chapter that the problem that Paul has been addressing finally kind of becomes clear. And as I said in the previous weeks, it seems that there were some of the Corinthians who were vaunting their gift above others, and they thought that they had the best gift of all. And it now becomes clear, as I mentioned earlier, that tongue speaking is the problem. It's the tongue speakers who think that they have the best gift. So Paul is going to suggest in this context that if you want to rank the gifts at all, you got to put prophecy ahead of tongue speaking. So before we go any farther, I probably should talk a little bit about what this thing is when we talk about tongue speaking. What is this? And this particular phenomenon is really interesting because it's not mentioned a whole lot in the New Testament. In fact, it only shows up in the book of Acts and then in this letter of 1 Corinthians. And there have been numerous suggestions as to what exactly tongue speaking might be. And one of those, it actually seems to have some evidence, and that's in chapter 2. If you look in Acts 2, the first mention of this, it does seem to refer to the speaking of foreign languages that you haven't learned. But if you look at all the other references, not only in Acts, but especially here in 1 Corinthians, it doesn't seem to be talking about that at all. In fact, especially in this chapter, it clearly doesn't seem to be foreign languages because Paul is going to use foreign languages as an illustration for what tongue speaking is. So the best and probably most likely suggestion for what Paul is referring to, the phenomenon that we're talking about with tongue speaking in the early church, is probably what we see in the modern Pentecostal movement when we talk about the phenomenon of glossolalia. And that is some kind of ecstatic speech. And what that means simply is that this is speech that is not formed. Oh, check him out. He's going to give me. This is for the old guy. This is really cool. Thank you. He's going to give the ecstatic speech is speech that's not created or formed in the brain consciously, that you're not trying to form any kind of idea of what you want to say, but it just kind of happens. Thank you. That's really helpful. This is cool. And so what we have here is not really a language. There's no syntax and vocabulary to it. In fact, it seems more like a series of syllables that are just kind of strung together in no recognizable structure. And to anybody on the outside who's listening, it kind of sounds simply like incoherent babbling. And that's the primary problem that Paul wants to address. So Paul is going to compare tongue speaking and prophecy and say that prophecy it has a higher value and it's superior, and specifically because it can be understood and tongue speaking can't. So if you look at this series of comparisons, Paul says that the tongue speaker is speaking to God and that no one understands them because they're uttering mysteries through the Spirit, and that it's only edifying to that individual, and that the Spirit prays but the mind is unfruitful. That's actually in verse 14, which we'll get to in a little bit. But then when he talks about prophecy, the prophet is speaking to the congregation, to other humans, and it strengthens and encourages and it comforts. It edifies the church. And so as a result, he wants to say prophecy is greater than tongue speaking because of the benefit it has for the body. He then goes on in the next section, which we won't read, but you can look at it and follow it through, and he uses 3 illustrations to describe kind of what uninterpreted tongue speaking is like. And the first one deals with either a flute or a harp. He says, if you blow through a flute or you simply strum a harp without making any distinct notes, there is noise, but there's no song. Kind of like if I were to try and do it, right? It just, you wouldn't recognize anything. You know that, okay, I hear sound, but there's no melody, there's no clear, distinct note. Secondly, he says, it's also like blowing through a bugle. Now, the bugle he has in mind here is kind of what they would use for the Roman army. And they would use, because it's a vast army, they use this instrument to signal various instructions. So, advance, retreat, stand your ground, whatever it might be. They'd have different notes that would be uttered for those different instructions. But if you're simply blowing through the bugle and you're not making any distinct sound, the army has no idea what to do. Just kind of like, what was that? I don't know. Maybe he said go eat. But the third illustration, he compares tongue speaking that is uninterpreted to what it would be like if you were hearing a foreign language speaker. You'd be like a foreigner to them, like a barbarian, because you wouldn't understand anything that's being said. So Paul makes this illustration of what it is like to hear a tongue speaker without any kind of interpretation. But then he suggests something even more interesting, and that is that even the tongue speaker doesn't know what they're talking about. So let's go on and read beginning in verse 12 of this chapter. So with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church. Therefore, one who speaks in a tongue should pray, that he may interpret. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. What am I to do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will pray with my mind also. I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also. Otherwise, if you give thanks with your spirit, how can anyone in the position of an outsider say amen to your thanksgiving when he does not know what you are saying? For you may be giving thanks well enough, but the other person is not being built up. So Paul says that when speaking in tongues, the spirit is praying, but the mind is unfruitful. So then you have to start asking, well, what's the whole point of tongue speaking anyway? And why do it? And it seems like it's this ecstatic experience in which the speaker feels directly connected with God because you are communing with God in a direct fashion through the Spirit. And so even though you don't know what you're saying, you know that you're communicating to God, and it can still be quite beneficial. In fact, I once dated a young lady who was a tongue speaker, and she would say that when she was speaking in tongues, she could pray for hours. But if she tried to do it in English, like 5 minutes would be a struggle for her. So it was this really feeling of connection with God. So that's a little bit about tongue speaking and what it is, but what we need to focus on here and recognize is the bigger picture of what Paul is saying in this chapter. Why is it that prophecy is better than tongues? Because it can benefit the church, not just an individual. Prophecy can build up the church and it can promote faith. And as we saw last week, that is the measure of what makes one gift better than the other. If it is for edification, if it can help others around us. And that's also at the heart of why the church gathers. So look at the section beginning in verse 26. What then, brothers? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If any speak in a tongue, let there be only 2 or at most 3, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent in the church and speak to himself and to God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and be encouraged. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. And so here we get a little window into what it looked like to worship in the early church. And the picture that Paul paints is of this kind of somewhat spontaneous worship service where each member plays a role, but there is no chaos. It's kind of this orderly dance of music and teaching and revelation. And all things are done specifically for edification, for the building up of the body. Now, Paul is also contrasting Christian worship with what you might find in some Greco-Roman context, specifically in terms of frenzied prophecy, that in this day and time there were what we call mantic prophets, where they would supposedly be taken over by the spirits or by the gods, and they would be in a trance, and they would just do this kind of frenzied presentation of in ecstatic fashion of what the gods were saying to them. But Paul says here, that's not how God's Spirit works. God's Spirit is different. The prophets can control themselves. They can take turns. And all things are done for the building up. But here's the key question. Building up of whom? Not God, but the worshipers. See, the gathering of these Christians is for the benefit of the body as a whole. And that's why uninterpreted tongues has no place, because it only benefits the individual who's speaking, and it doesn't have any effect on the body. So it should be done at home, alone, when you're by yourself. Yet the bigger picture here that we need to notice is the focus of the gathering. Why is it that they're there? The purpose of the worship service is itself for the edification of Christians. But I thought worship was about God. Well, it is, and it isn't. This is kind of interesting. So let's take a step back, and I want to talk a little bit about this phenomenon of worship in general. And of course, in the Old Testament, the primary form of worship was sacrifice of animals. And I'm glad we don't do that anymore. And I always kind of found that odd as a child. Why in the world did God require the sacrifice of animals? I mean, did he like to watch things die? Did he like the smell of burning flesh? I mean, I would hear people say something about appeasing the wrath of God. I'm thinking, okay, that doesn't seem too flattering to God, that he's got so much wrath. Right? And what kind of God are we talking about anyway? I mean, why is it that we come together and adore this God in such extreme language? Did you notice the words of the songs that we sang today? I mean, to sing his praises and continually to thank him and say how great he is in prayer and song. Is God really that insecure that he needs this constant reaffirmation? Is God narcissistic? I mean, what's up with this worship thing? What does it mean to worship? What's going on here? And so I think if we look back and we start reflecting on this phenomenon of worship as a whole throughout the Bible, it becomes really interesting. And there's three specific words I want to talk about that are primarily related to worship and are often translated as worship. Three words in Greek. They reflect, in the Old Testament at least, the use of the Hebrew as well, but I'll deal with the Greek words. The first word is proskuneo. And it's a really interesting word because it's often translated as bowing down. And in human context, it referred to prostrating oneself before a ruler and either kissing their feet or the hem of their garment. Proskuneo. You can hear the word prostrate almost in there, right? It was used to express this attitude. It was a gesture of one's complete dependence or submission to a higher authority. It was then, of course, applied to the worship of gods, but it was primarily through one's posture. So if you look at the definition for this word, it can mean things like to fall down and worship, to do obeisance to, to prostrate oneself before. That this is a physical act by which one acknowledges the superiority of another. In this case, in the case of humans, of course, of a king or ruler. In the case of God, of his superior power. And I can't imagine, people today feeling very comfortable bowing down in this form to any other human. I mean, it's a rather kind of humiliating act. But it's also a very ancient form of worship and one still practiced by many still today. Of course, think about Muslims. They do this, every day, bowing down to God. And one should never underestimate the power of posture, especially as it relates to worship. So when we bow our heads, right, we're often acknowledging God's superiority. But try going prostrate. I'm sure some of you have, probably in the privacy of your own home. But go prostrate before God, and the whole different sensation ensues, right? I mean, there's a sense of humility there that you just can't get in any other way. So from one perspective, worship is an acknowledgement of our complete dependence upon God. But we do this not because God needs this acknowledgement, not because we're trying to stroke his ego. We do this because we need it, right? We need to be reminded that God is God and that we are not. That God is the provider. He is the rock. He is the redeemer. He is the one to whom we must look for all good things. Because when we forget this, then we begin to think a little too highly of ourselves. And we start kind of wandering off on our own way. And when we do that, all kinds of bad things begin to happen and we get into trouble. So when we come together as a body to worship God, it's a regular reminder that there is something greater than ourselves. It's a reminder to look to him and not ourselves. Now, a second key word, which is also interesting, is often translated as worship, is latruo, which in essence, at the very kind of heart of it, is to hire oneself out as a worker or to serve or be a servant. And so it's often translated to serve. And it could mean, in kind of pagan context, just being a servant. But then it came to refer to serving the gods. And in our biblical context, it only refers to serving God by performing religious kinds of duties. So this idea of church service is not too far off, right? That we're here serving God in what we do. When we gather together and perform religious rites, when we say prayers and we partake of communion and we sing songs, we're serving God in some form or fashion. Yet once again, the key point in all of these religious duties that we do, they're more for us than they are for God, right? So let's go back and talk about that Old Testament practice. Why is it that God required the sacrifice of animals? Now, from one perspective, you might look at it and say, well, there's definitely a theological message in the sacrifice of animals, that what we're talking about here is that sin leads to death, and someone has to pay the penalty for death, and so sacrifice has that message. But on another level, you could say, yeah, but every single religion at that time offered sacrifice. It was the way that you worshiped the gods back then. And so when God instructed the Israelites to sacrifice, that was because that was the way everybody worshipped back then. And yes, there was a message in the form, but the sacrifices were not primarily there to appease God. They were a reminder to the worshipers, first of their dependence on God, but also acknowledgement of their devotion to God. And so we can see clearly that God wasn't so concerned about the actual ritual in statements in the prophets. So for example, look at Amos 5. When Israelites forgot what they were doing, the prophets would come and say things like this: I despise your feasts and take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. You see, what God wanted was not their empty rituals, not the acts themselves, but the heart behind those acts, the heart that inspired those actions. The rituals were meant to demonstrate their love and devotion for God. And if there's no love and devotion, then the acts are worthless. So too, when we come together to sing and pray, it's not because God needs us to do these specific acts. They are for us to physically act out and act upon our devotion, to remind ourselves that God is God, that God is at the center. Worship helps us to remember what is important, who is important in our lives, what is at the very cement. It helps us reaffirm our commitment to God. The third word for worship we won't talk a whole lot about is sebeomai, and this is a more generic word for worship that talks about expressing through rites or actions or whatever one's devotional reverence for another, specifically oftentimes for God. And so it can mean to show profound respect for an individual, but in the sense of a deity, to show one's ultimate profound respect for the deity. We oftentimes even translate this sometimes to fear God, right? In the sense of having profound respect for. And that kind of fits in with everything we've talked about so far. So as I reflect on worship in the biblical context, what's interesting is the way it's so focused on helping us. And I don't want to imply that God gets nothing out of worship. You know, as a father, I can tell you that there's a whole lot more enjoyment in my life when I hear my children's heartfelt thanks over something I have done for them, versus when they simply assume, well, you're supposed to do that because you're dad, right? And that no one likes to be taken for granted, right? And it means a whole lot more when my kids take time out to talk with me or visit with me versus simply ignoring me. That's never a fun thing either, right? So too, God takes pleasure from our devotions in that sense of what they represent. Yet the key message I think we should focus on here as we reflect on worship is that the time that we spend gathering to engage in corporate worship is not simply about obeying God's commands, as some people say. We don't go to church because God said so. Worship is not about placating or appeasing God, as if God will cause bad things to happen in my life if I don't go to church, or He'll send me to hell because I didn't go to church enough. That's not the point. No, we gather together because we need this. And we need it desperately. We need to be reminded and to remind ourselves on a regular basis of what God means to us. And we need to do these things physically. We need to open our mouths and sing these songs. We need to bow our head in prayer. We need to take the bread and the wine and put it in our mouths. These are all tangible reminders of whose we are and what we're about and our new identity in Christ. But we also do these things corporately, because we need to encourage and support one another. Each of us is at a different place in our walk. Some of us might be at a spiritual high point while others are struggling. And we get together to be encouraged and to encourage, to know that we are not alone in our faith, that there are others who are struggling along beside us, to know that others also believe, and to hear the stories and to know that God is at work in them, so that when I can't see it in my own life, I can see it in others and I can be encouraged and know that it will happen for me. Worship is in praise of God, but it is we who are the primary beneficiaries. So when I think back on those early childhood experiences, it was horrendous from a human perspective. And I kind of have this vision of God wearing earplugs, but with this huge smile on his face, right? Not because our worship was pleasing to the ear, clearly not, if you'd heard us sing. It's bad. And not because we were saying all kinds of nice things about him, not because we were being obedient, but because by gathering together and what we did, it was a sign of our relationship with him. It was a proclamation of our love for him, no matter how horrendous it was from an earthly perspective. And so why is God concerned about order in worship? Why not simply let go with frenzied speech? Because worship is more than adoring God. It's about recognizing each other as family. I'd like the praise team to come up as we close. Coming together in this corporate setting is about helping each of us grow and be built up in the faith, encouraging each of us. God is most pleased when he sees his children caring for each other. And that is the best gift that we could give him. When we love each other, as God loves us, God is honored more than any sacrifice we might give. So let us come together week after week and praise him and encourage each other. Let's worship.